Chapter 3. Boston College isn't a small college, and it's not in Boston. It's a large university in Newton, Massachusetts, 6 miles from Boston. The location is as good as it gets. Newton is an upscale neighborhood, downtown Boston is accessible on the T, which has a terminus right next to campus, and the campus itself is small enough to make walking to any part of it quick. BC has 9,000 undergraduates and a nationally known football team. But that's not why I went there. I got a full scholarship plus room and board. It had to be the work of Father Donutty and the Cardinal. With these people fighting for me, I would be stretching my luck going my own way. Besides, I had some responsibilities to my parents who were comfortably well off, but not rich enough for astronomical tuition costs. Father Donutty remained in Framingham, again, probably the work of the Cardinal. Priests are usually moved around more often. He was not too many miles from me, and I might move back to Framingham. Every freshman wants to make a good first impression. The first night on campus, the girls wandered from room to room, socializing with their dormitory mates, as if the first day determined their social life for the next 4 years. I soon found how sheltered I'd been in Framingham compared to the sophisticated kids from New York and other big cities. That night, I realized I was not going to be the spark plug of the college scene, but that was okay. Just as Framingham High hadn't been the final definition of my life, neither would BC. Monday brought the chaos of finding my way around campus, finding the classrooms of my courses, which had been set up before I arrived, and standing in line at the bookstore. The assignments I got in my classes seemed endless. Could anybody do all that work in a semester? After my last Monday class, I relaxed in my room to unwind. Then a group of girls invited me to join them at supper, and we walked out to the cafeteria. We got our food and sat down. From long habit, I looked across the room. There was a group of kids at a nearby table looking at me. A girl learns to read expressions. One boy was intently looking at me. I called him Mr. Intense. He was very handsome, with short hair as black as my own, and he was around 6 feet, which was a good match for my 5 feet 4 inches. I liked taller guys, and apparently he liked smaller girls. He wasn't gawking at a pretty girl or lusting for her body. He looked interested, and that's okay. A girl gets used to being looked at. But it wasn't Mr. Intense who made the first move. A boy next to him, Mr. Fast Move, brought his food tray over to my table. "Hi," said Mr. Fast Move. "Can I sit here?" "Sure," I said with a smile. I had been advised to be friendly from day one or be labeled a tease for the rest of our 4 years. "I'm Jack Coster," said Mr. Fast Move. "Aren't you Theresa Sullivan, the baseball player?" I had been on television a lot. "I am," I said, and we were off and running. I noticed that Mr. Intense looked disappointed. It made me think of someone whose neighbor won the lottery. That night I looked up both Jack Coster and Mr. Intense on the computer. BC provided free disk space, and all the students were urged to set up a web page about themselves before they got to school. The kids' dormitories were listed, which made it easy to find people if you didn't know their names. It turned out, not only did Jack and Mr. Intense both live in my dormitory, they were 2 doors away from each other. So, if Jack and I were an item, Mr. Intense was unlikely to interfere. I read the computer screen. Jack was a boy from close to New York City, but not in it. His father was owner of a specialty food store. Jack was going to be a history major, a guarantee of a job in his father's store. Mr. Intense was Steve Hartley. His father was a physicist for Intel, and Steve was majoring in physics, too. That was interesting. He mentioned he was Catholic. Also interesting. Students' personalities showed in their research pages. Steve's page showed the kid of a research physicist, precise, succinct, and somewhat lacking in spontaneity. Something like myself, actually. It wasn't a bad thing, except in reality TV shows where they have to keep the gab going all the time. Jack was a genuinely nice guy, a good talker, and the stereotypical boy from New York who had plenty of stories to tell. He seemed to be a gentleman. Jack knew I was not the kind of girl who had to put up with foul language or crude jokes, and he carefully avoided them. He was one smooth operator. We were soon eating in the cafeteria together whenever our schedules allowed, and around campus generally. One Sunday, Steve saw me at Mass. He looked embarrassed, like somebody who had missed his chance, not somebody who did something bad. Well, 4 years is a long time, and the campus had a lot of women. Steve seemed nice in person. He always gave me a little smile like he was glad to see me. He and Jack were casual friends and apparently didn't talk about me. But I'd seen the looks. Steve was genuinely interested. I didn't know what I felt about him. We never had a conversation alone. There was nothing wrong with dating Jack for a while. It was already clear that we were not compatible enough for lifetime commitment. He was a little careless about schoolwork and had no passion for his major. I was fanatical about mine. But Jack was fun to be around for the time being. I was walking out of biology lecture on the way back to the dorm to wait for lunch when I heard an authoritative male voice. "Theresa Sullivan?" It was a campus cop. "Yes?" "We have a problem. Can you come to our office?" "I don't know where it is. I'll follow you." A campus wasn't so big that you couldn't reach any central place in 5 minutes. I followed 100 feet behind the cop so people wouldn't notice. We arrived at the campus police office. I was led to a conference room, nothing but a board with a long table and chairs and a grease board. There were 9 police there, 2 20-something guys who looked like upperclassmen, and a priest in his 60s. The senior cop painted the picture. "This is BC President Father Walter Haynes," he said. "We saw these 2 men following you around the campus. Do you know them?" I looked at the 2 men. They were either my watchers or nutcases. If they were watchers, they must not have said anything yet. They'd be ordered not to. But there they were, and the school had to be told something. I thought about all this a moment. Father Haynes interrupted my thoughts. "You seem to be a very interesting young lady, Miss Sullivan. The Holy Father himself paid for your scholarship." "Did he say why?" "No. It's a big secret." I spoke to the 2 young guys, assuming they were watchers. "I've been here a week. It's not so easy following somebody on a campus, huh?" "It isn't," said one of them, looking for guidance. They were watchers. I said, "It's gone too far. They'll go to the FBI and the newspaper. Call your boss." He pulled out a cell phone and whispered to somebody. After a few moments, he said, "He's calling the director." Eyebrows went up around the room. The tension built as we waited for something to happen on the other end of the phone call. Then the watcher told me. The director is calling the President of the United States. Did I have everybody's attention now? You bet. A few more moments and the watcher handed the phone to the senior cop. "He wants to talk to you." The cop took the phone and was read the riot act. "Yes, sir. Yes, sir. No, sir. I understand, sir. I wouldn't want that either, sir." After a minute, the senior cop handed the phone back to my watcher. He told everybody the facts of life. "We will say nothing about this to anybody, not to each other, not to our wives, not to our dogs. This situation does not exist, nor will it ever exist. That's all." I could have walked out in an instant, but hung around a moment for effect. I looked at each person with an air of confidence. I looked like I had the situation well under control, and they'd better listen to the prez. Then I walked out. Come October, it was homecoming week, always a big weekend on any college campus. There were many special activities going on, and we had to choose a list. Friday nights, the kids would hang around, meaning drift up and down the dormitory hall, talking and joking with anybody there. Jack had suggested we go to a movie at 8. I went down to the 2nd floor to hang around until movie time. Jack's door was open, and I walked in. There were 6 boys visiting Jack, including Steve Hartley, and 1 girl. As soon as I entered, everybody went silent. I knew something was very wrong. I waited as everyone looked embarrassed. The girl stood next to Jack. She looked possessive. "Hi, Teresa," said Jack with not a lot of enthusiasm. "This is Ginny." "Hi," I said. There was not much else to say until I found out something. "Ginny dropped in by surprise," Jack said. "Yeah, I could see that. I couldn't remember seeing her around campus, or at least not in our complex. She might be somebody from outside." The embarrassing silence continued. Ginny looked very uncomfortable. She had known no more about me than the other way around. Ginny's position near Jack made it clear she considered herself his girlfriend. "Do you have anything to say, Jack?" I asked. "I'll be up in a few minutes." I went back upstairs. This was the most humiliating experience I ever had. All those boys were watching. So, two-timing Jack was coming up for a last look, was he? I'd give him something to look at. I went to the closet and pulled out my little black nothing. It was a backless dress made of flimsy, clingy material. It was something appropriate for a party, but in my room, with no other girls to look at, Jack would find it hard to forget. He deserved the VIP treatment. 6 inches above the knee wasn't a big deal these days, but to make it more interesting, I folded back the hemline 3 more inches inside the skirt and taped it. Now that was a dress. I put it on and looked in the full-length mirror on the door. Yup, this would kill Jack. He'd promised to throw Ginny out the window if I took him back. Sorry, Jack. Too late for that. I waited a few minutes. There was no knock on the door. I sat on the bed and turned on the television. They were showing the early part of The Caine Mutiny. I'd seen it before. Captain Queeg was a paranoid personality who couldn't take adversity. It made him a dictator on the ship. He made his men miserable with his inflexible demands. Later, there would be an ultimate crisis, a monstrous typhoon that threatened to sink the ship. That's when the captain lost it, and his chief mate Merrick took over the ship on the grounds that the captain was nuts. As a reward for his courageous saving of the ship, Merrick was put on trial for mutiny. My dad, who had been in the Navy, read the book and said half of it was about a love story between Ensign Keith and a girl who wanted to be a singer. Eventually her career took off, and she left the ensign. Dad guessed that this boring love story meant something to the author, but it dragged down the book. The movie producers wisely dropped the singer's story and concentrated on the mutiny. It worked because the chief mate's willingness to sacrifice his career to save the crew was a very effective love story of sorts. I noticed something similar in a book called The Robe, which my grandmother gave me. It was written by a Methodist minister who filled it with quotes from the Bible. It was a spectacular, best-selling book in World War II when the world looked like it was falling apart. But it would probably bomb today. In the Hollywood movie starring Richard Burton, all the Bible quotes were dropped, and they concentrated on the conflict between Burton and Caligula. But Burton and his girl marched off to martyrdom from a more dramatic Emperor's throne room scene than was in the book. Sometimes subtle messages work better than speeches. That's how I operate. I could have criticized Jack in front of his friends for dating me without telling Ginny, but I said nothing. I let people think it out for themselves. The movie ended with the Caine sailing back out to sea. Ensign Keith was the only officer of the original crew left after the devastating trial. The next movie was one of those horrible made-for-TV Walking Dead movies. I couldn't stand them and turned off the TV. The problem with that trash is it didn't address an individual's decisions in life. It was insulting to avoid challenging the viewer's ideas, as if his ideas didn't matter. At least in the Caine Mutiny, you were challenged to think whether you would have the courage to take over the ship like Merrick. If you were a real thinker, you'd consider why the Navy didn't look into the circumstances of the monsoon scene before rushing into putting Merrick on trial. Apparently, nothing had been said before the trial. I stared at my roommate's wall. There was nothing to do, and I was milking my loneliness. People who never went to college believed it was one continuous party. In fact, parties were rare. Some colleges had nearby drinking spots just outside the campus where kids crowded in until the fire codes were broken twice over. But BC wasn't like that. It was all residential zone and no commercial. College life was mostly studying and killing time with inane activities. It was a test. If you could stand this life for 4 years, you could stand anything. A lot of kids went nuts and dropped out. After half an hour moping on my bed, I moved to my desk and resumed moping. Paging through old magazines was my pretense of doing something. The truth was, I was desperately lonely. I thought of going downstairs to see what was going on, but after the scene in Jack's room, my loneliness would be too obvious. I still had a little pride. It was amazing how quiet it could be on the girls' floor. That was another thing people got wrong. It was now nearly 9 o'clock, and I was in tears. There was nobody around here who cared for me. There wasn't one person I could walk up to and call friend to their face. There was a knock on the door. "Come in," I said. Steve Hartley walked in. He walked up close to my desk and said, "Ginny is Jack's hometown girlfriend. They've been seeing each other for years. She was supposed to show up next week, but she came early. So, it was going to be all over anyway." "Did you know about her?" "No, none of us did." "Have a seat." I indicated the bed. He sat down on the edge of it. We looked at each other. I must have looked pretty sad after a miserable evening. I sensed that he was aware of how lonely I'd been, but somehow I didn't mind his knowing. "Anything going on in the dorm?" I suggested. "There's an all-night card game." I heard about the boys playing cards all night. You would think something exciting was going on, but all they did was throw cards around. There was no intelligent conversation possible when all you did was look at your cards. Why did they do it? He glanced at my legs. My hemline was practically up to my hips when I sat down. Nothing excited boys more than a short skirt. Bikinis didn't do as much. "You're quiet, Steve. Something on your mind?" "Yeah, I'm trying not to think about what I might see." "I'm wearing a thong. You won't see anything but my hip." "And a nice hip it is, I'm sure." I laughed. Frankness cleared the air. "Will you stay with me a while, Steve?" "I want to." I smiled. "I think we can find something interesting to talk about." I stood up and reached for a deck of DVDs high on my bookcase. The DVDs were of the famous BBC production series, Victoria. "You ever watch this, Steve?" "No." "You'll like it," I said while walking over to put the first disc in the player. An 18-year-old girl becomes Queen of England in the British Empire. Everybody wants something from her. She survives 8 assassination attempts. You wonder how a teenage girl got through it. You wonder if you'd have the nerve to take on what she did. I indicated that he move over a couple of feet and sit back against the pile of cushions. I sat next to him with my left arm in reach of my desk. "This is more interesting than playing cards, don't you think?" "Yeah," he said with a smile. "You'll get used to me soon, Steve. We have to get over this awkward moment." The feelings of an 18-year-old boy in this close encounter weren't hard to guess. I felt safe. There was no way he was going to try to take advantage of me like some boy who would keep trying to get something that wasn't his right. Anyway, I could throw him out the window. Victoria was made for the English who already knew the story. It was very complicated, with rapid changes from one subplot to another. I had to explain the characters and their motivations. Steve seemed interested. There was much to talk about. We both marveled at the responsibility the girl took on. She could have withdrawn in her castle and ignored everything going on in the world. She went out to be seen by the people, despite assassination attempts, and made heavy decisions like sending a band of traitors to Australia instead of letting them be drawn and quartered. Her uncle was next in line if she abdicated. He did maneuvers to bring this about. The girl queen told him, I have made mistakes, and perhaps I will make more, but I'm a better monarch than you could ever be. I wondered if I could do as well at her age. We took 2 breaks during the night to go downstairs and get little snacks out of the food machine. Some people saw us at 2 a.m., which was sure to start rumors. By daylight, we were giggling from fatigue. We went to breakfast. I was still wearing my little black dress, which stood out at breakfast. It was obvious from our demeanors that we'd been up all night. Girls gave us the eye. I didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. We hadn't done anything we couldn't tell our parents. Nosy girls filled our tables and asked what we did all night. Nothing, I said. Sure, Theresa. Steve joked. The video is on YouTube. We suddenly had lots of friends. An attractive couple was invited to everything. Steve and I were perfect for each other. We could spend hours together without talking, or we could chatter like 8-year-olds when the mood struck us. I fell for him like a 15-year-old girl in her first love, because really, Steve was my first love. He was too smart to take advantage of me. He also felt he'd found the right mate and didn't want to mess things up. We had differences in interests and opinions, but nothing critical. Taking a hint from comments of our parents and grandparents, we promised not to try to change each other. That's what kills a lot of marriages. Nobody could change a spouse, and if you even wanted to, hadn't the marriage already failed? We promised that Theresa would always be Theresa, Steve would always be Steve, and that's the way it would be forever. It was like the situation with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson we studied in American history class. The 2 men were both in Washington's cabinet and argued about everything. Washington had a hard time keeping them from killing each other. Jefferson had been a wealthy kid and had an easy time of it. Hamilton spent his youth on a horrible Caribbean island that made Devil's Island look good. It was the last refuge of criminals trying to escape the law. Slaves had a 5-year life expectancy. Human life had no value. So, Jefferson trusted human nature and wanted a nation of gentlemen farmers with little government. Hamilton thought men were scum and wanted a strong central government in control. Between Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and Louisiana Purchase, and Hamilton's Central Bank and other government institutions, these 2 men built the America we know. So why did they fight each other in the cabinet? They were founding a nation. They should have been friends. Like those 2 founding fathers, Steve and I had different childhoods. I had Hal to worry about since age 10. I had to consider that someday I would have to take part in world affairs. What would happen if the world found out about Hal? It would be chaos. That's why the government was watching me day and night. My father said I'd be captain of my ship and had to learn all I could about the world. Yeah, well, I might be captain of a lot more than my ship. I took an interest in politics, sociology, and history, though not enough to want a career in any of them. Steve had 2 sisters and a brother, happily married parents, and a good family income. If he had a theme song, it would be Everything is Beautiful in its own way. He wanted to be a physicist like his father and had no interest in politics. He was Jefferson, who thought people would turn out all right, and I was Hamilton, worried about the worst, but we never argued. We got along beautifully. Steve was years ahead of boys his age. He understood that a girl wants romance, not sex just to fulfill some urge. He did nothing ungentlemanly the first time he entered my dorm room, despite my compromising situation. He wanted a lifetime commitment, as I did. Despite almost universal skepticism, there really are gentlemen like Steve in the world, and every girl wants to be a lady who catches one. The current Miss Massachusetts was at BC. She went out with a guy with glasses and an extroverted, jolly personality that reminded me of Jeff Winslow, my high school steady. This was not what people would call a man's man, but eat your heart out, guys. He was dating Miss Massachusetts. I found out that the previous year he had been the steady escort of that year's Miss Massachusetts, too. He'd found the secret of dating outstanding women. He treated them like ladies. So it was with Steve. I noticed girls looked at us with envy. They could see we had that eternal love of a Disney full-length animated movie. Someday my prince will come, sang Snow White. Yeah, well, I had my prince. In a month, we knew we'd get married, and we wanted it soon. Well, really, now. Could we go 4 years without doing it? Mom and Dad raised the parental eyebrows when they learned of our plans following a whirlwind courtship. Fortunately, Father Doughnutty got to know Steve well in our meetings to plan the wedding. Father convinced my parents that Steve was as fine a boy as I was ever likely to meet, and while we were young, he'd found that some young couples were still together 60 years later. There was nothing to indicate our marriage wouldn't work. On the other hand, discouraging it might cause harm. It was a dilemma for my parents. Eventually, they approved. It all came down to one question. Did Steve and I know what we were doing? Father Doughnutty had seen many young marriages fail and knew the reasons. He believed Steve and I would succeed. The large Sullivan clan had waited for years to see this girl's wedding, and they weren't disappointed. I was gorgeous as a recently turned 18-year-old. For the church service, I wore a 2-piece wedding gown. A floor-length wide skirt with spaghetti shoulder straps was made from matte Duchess satin. Over this, I had a jacket made of peekaboo cotton Venice lace that more or less covered my shoulders and the top half of my upper arm so as not to scandalize the congregation. At the reception, the jacket and train came off, and my shoulders and cleavage charmed the crowd. And now we set off to find out what life was all about. Henry David Thoreau was a 19th century philosopher who lived not far from Boston. He spent a year in a one-room shack in the woods next to Walden Pond to find himself. He said other men could journey to Africa to shoot giraffes if they wanted, but he preferred to stay home and shoot himself. What he meant was you should explore your inner self. You'll find you own a territory greater than the Russian czars. Men try to prove their courage by going to unexplored jungles, hunting lions with spears, or climbing the tallest mountain, but they don't have the courage to examine themselves. Thoreau said that, not me. Blame him. Anyway, Steve and I would explore ourselves and each other. We hoped to like what we found. We moved into a small apartment for privacy during the summer break. It belonged to a retired couple who spent all the warm months touring the United States in an RV, something a lot of retirees did, we learned. Steve's father gave us a new Chevrolet as a wedding present. I was driving the car alone one Saturday to go grocery shopping, thinking of the wonderful future waiting for me.